Hey everybody, welcome to our 1 o'clock Eastern session at Drupal Camp Asheville. Glad everybody's here today. My name is Mark Shropshire, and I will just be moderating and helping out a bit. So want to kick off by introducing today's topic. And this one is on the migration deep dive, and it's around layout builder, panels to layout builder. Our presenter today is Brian Tofte-Schumacher. He is a senior developer at Forum One, based in Seattle. Been working with Drupal for 5 years and on the web since he was a teenager. For the past year, he's been focused on migrating websites from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. And he's looking forward to sharing what he's learned along the way. So just a couple of housekeeping items. Please drop questions in the chat, the session chat. I'll collect those, and we'll have some time at the end to let Brian answer some of those questions. And without further ado, I'll turn it over to Brian.
Awesome. Thank you, Mark. Thanks for that introduction. As Mark said, I'm Brian Tofte-Schumacher. I actually live out in Seattle, but Forum One is based in Virginia, and some of my colleagues have heard of Drupal Camp Asheville before and have attended and really recommended it. So thanks for the opportunity to speak here. Just a quick note, Forum One is a digital service agency that partners with mission-driven organizations. We've been around for 23 years, partnered with 1,000 organizations and government agencies. We provide digital strategy, creative technology, data, and user experience services. And as Mark said, I've really been focused for the last year on kind of Drupal 7 to Drupal 8 migrations. And this one that I've been working on recently has been pretty interesting, where we've been migrating data from Panelizer in Drupal 7 to Layout Builder in Drupal 8. Also just wanted to give a quick shout out to understanddrupal.com. I noticed Mauricio was here at the camp. The 31 days of Drupal migrations really helped me understand all this stuff. So thank you for that. It's kind of one of the reasons why I love the Drupal community. There's so much information out there. All right, so without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. The goal of today's presentation is to kind of use the work that I've done on the US Environmental Protection Agency's website, epa.gov. I've done a lot of the migration for that. It's a very large website, but we're going to focus today specifically on the migration from Panelizer to Layout Builder. I do have a lot of content here. I'm going to try and squeeze it into 30 minutes. So drop in the chat if I need to go faster, or if I need to stay on something for a little longer. So just to give you a little overview of the EPA website, this is the homepage there on the right. As I said, we're partnering with them to migrate epa.gov from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8. D7 use panelizers with panes on thousands of pages, and we're migrating those to Layout Builder. As far as I know, there aren't any contributed solutions to kind of handle this migration path for you. In a lot of cases, when you're migrating from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, there's already some really great work in the contrib space. From my perspective, because Panelizer can be so customized and so specific to a site, I think it'll take a lot of work to create one solution that will work for everyone. So I came up with kind of a custom solution using some source plugins and process plugins that allowed me to accomplish this. And I also want to say, this is one way of doing this. I know there's many ways of doing everything in Drupal. So if you have any kind of reactions or thoughts about this approach, I'd love to hear them at the end. So just to give you an example of a page that we might be migrating, we're looking here at a water topics page on the epa.gov. And this page uses what's called the research directory layout. So you can see we've got sorry, I couldn't find my mouse. We've got some content that kind of spans across this main column here at the start. And then we have a sidebar that has a couple blocks in it. And then underneath, back in this main column, we've got kind of some grid content that's arranged in a 2x2 grid. So if we were to look at Panelizer, the way this page was created, we've got our main column with that one piece of content that spans across the top, our sidebar with our 2 additional pieces of content, and then we can kind of see the grid in this section below. And then at the bottom, there's actually another section that spans all the way across. And just to give you the full understanding of the page, just did a little screen recording of scrolling down the page, just to give you the full context. So that Panelizer layout resulted in this page. So next, let's talk about kind of how we would manually accomplish this using Layout Builder. So I recorded a screen recording just because my local development environment can be a little bit slow and I didn't want to go back and forth. So when I click play on this video, we're going to be starting at the edit screen for a node, and then I'm going to click on the layout tab just to orient you. So we're in the edit section, we're clicking layout. And so this is the Layout Builder interface where it starts out blank. I'm going to add a section. And the layout for this section is going to be that resource directory layout. We don't need to give it a title. That won't be displayed. And now we can see we have all those same regions that existed in Panelizer. We have the main region that spreads across. We have a spot for our sidebar. So I'm just showing manually adding a block to the top region. That says paragraph. I know that you can't read it. And so the way these paragraphs are going to be arranged in Layout Builder, we're going to do a nested structure. So we're going to have a box paragraph that then has an HTML paragraph inside of it. Essentially, that just allows for some additional styling. So we've created the box. Now we're adding the HTML. And I forgot to turn off display title. So we're not going to display the title. And then I'm just going to add some kind of filler content for this HTML paragraph, just to give you an idea of what the content editing experience would look like if we were creating this page manually. So now I've added the block to that first region. Oh, I should have paused it, but you could see that that paragraph with the box and the HTML paragraph showed up in that first region, which would be equivalent to that first block of text that we saw on the page. So now that we kind of understand what we're trying to accomplish here, we're migrating from Panelizer to Layout Builder. We're going to focus in on one layout. And in the code I'm going to end up showing you, we're actually going to focus in on just one block because, spoiler alert, this is pretty complicated. So the code is quite expansive, I'll say. So I really tried to boil this down just to the necessary code so that we could focus on the Layout Builder sections and components that we're creating programmatically. But before we dive into that code, let's just talk a little bit about the migration lifecycle, just to make sure everyone understands how migrations work in Drupal 8. So a migration is an extract, transform, and load kind of process that uses this framework, ETL. And ETL is something that's kind of used in database land, and it's a common industry way of thinking about how you do migrations. So in Drupal, extract is kind of thought of as the source phase of the migration. Transform is thought of as the process phase of the migration, and load is thought of as the destination phase of the migration. So if you're more visual, this is from Drupal.org. The source on the left would be the Drupal 7 database, and then in the middle, we're transforming the data or processing it. So we've got some data from the Drupal 7 database. We need to change it so we can store it in Drupal 8. And then the destination on the right is the Drupal 8 database where we're going to save the content. And these migrations are defined in a file that's called a configuration YAML. So YAML is just a kind of a human readable language where we can define processes and configuration. So the important part to note here is there's a source section of this file, there's a process section, and then there's a destination. No surprise. So in the source, that's where we're going to connect to the Drupal 7 database, and we're going to pull out some data that we want. And in process, that's where we're going to, like I said, transform that data from the Drupal 7 format into the Drupal 8 format. And then destination, that's going to save it. In this case, we're saving it to a node, and it's going to be using the basic page bundle. To talk a little bit about the process step. So when you write a source plugin, you're basically writing a query that will pull data from the Drupal 7 database. And then in the process step, when we process these, we're processing each node individually, what's known as rows. So if you think about, we're going to pull some rows from the database, then we're going to process each of them individually. All right, so now we can start to talk about some of the implementation for how we would actually create these source plugins and process plugins in order to get the data out and store it in Layout Builder. So this is what we're working toward, similar to that first configuration YAML that I showed you. But in this case, we're going to write a custom source plugin that's called EPA Panelizer node. And what that's going to do is just load up the nodes that used Panelizer that I want to migrate. And then process. I also should note in this process phase, every field that you want to migrate into Drupal 8 is defined here. We're just looking at the layout builder __ layout field because that's where we're going to store the data from Panelizer converted into layout builder, and then we're going to store it in this field. Normally, these files can be hundreds of lines long because you're defining this process step for every field. In some cases, it could just be, to go on a tangent for a second, if we're just like bringing the node ID over, this would say nid, the plugin would be get, and the source would be nid, like we saw in the first example, and then we don't have to do any processing. We're just bringing that value over directly. But this definition for the layout builder field allows us to use this process plugin that we're going to create called EPA panes to layout builder section. And we're going to pass in some data that we're going to get in the source plugin so that we can actually transform that data into layout builder data. So how are we going to do this? First, it's important to understand the database structures, both for what exists in Panelizer and Drupal 7 and what exists for Layout Builder in Drupal 8, so that we can know basically what tables to query and which data we need to get. And then next, we can actually write the source plugin to query the Drupal 7 database, and then we can write the process plugin to transform the panes into Layout Builder blocks and sections, and then we can implement the migration configuration and run the migration and see that the data was pulled over. So there's really three tables that are important for us to look at in Drupal 7. If we start on the left, the Panelizer entity table essentially tells us which nodes are using Panelizer. And that's defined by adding a display ID, storing a display ID for these nodes. So node 1 has a display ID of 2, it's using Panelizer. And then there's a panels display table, which based on the display ID is going to tell us what layout it's using. So in our example, the layout would be resource directory homepage. And then there's finally this panels pane table, which actually stores the content that is displayed on the page, those individual sections of the layout where you are actually creating well, they were the blocks in Drupal 8, but the panes in Drupal 7, that's all that data stored in the panels pane table, with one big caveat, of course. So this site also was using fieldable panel panes, which allows a pane to actually have fields, which are then stored in separate database tables. We'll look at that a little bit. I did simplify this a little, and most of the data for these simple panes is stored in the configuration field, and that's going to be like a serialized array where we can pull the values out. So if it just has some HTML, it's going to have like a configuration, and then it's going to have a key like body value, and we could just get the body value out of that. For a fieldable panel pane, we actually have to do a second query, load up that body field, and then get the value from that additional table. All right, hopefully you're following me here. So if we look at a little bit of the data, again, this is simplified. It's not all the columns, just to continue this understanding of the database. So the Panelizer entity table, we're going to look at one node. We'll say it has entity ID 1, and it has a display ID of 500. And then the display for that display ID 500 is going to be RD homepage, resource directory homepage, which is the layout we've been looking at. And then here's the panes table, an example of what a panes table might look like for that display ID. So the display ID really is the key that's shared between these three tables. And the important thing for us to pass on to the Drupal 8 is all these individual panes, so that we can basically extract the data from them, create them as blocks, and load them into Layout Builder. This actually is, the IDs are different, but the type, subtype, and configuration, that actually is pulled from the Drupal 7 database for that page I was showing you. And you could see most of those things on that page were fieldable panels panes. And there could be many different types of panes defined in Drupal 7, but Anyway, we're just looking at this one node with these panes. Oh, and another important thing to notice from this table is the panel column. Basically, that'll tell you where in the layout this pane should be displayed. So the main call panel was that kind of top panel at the top of the layout that spanned the 2 fields on the left. And then there was this sidebar, but that would be next to this column. But you can also see the other panels. So RDA1, RDA2, those are like A, B, and C are the rows, and then 1 and 2 are the columns. So that 2x2 or 3x2 grid you saw. And then there's additional panels for the bottom and the sidebars. I have the first row here highlighted just because we're going to, that's the pane we're going to focus on when we get to the code part. All right. I did have another slide here about fieldable panels panes, just to reiterate, there's additional tables for the fields that are stored on those panes. And since that first one is a fieldable panel pane, I'm going to show us, we're going to be pulling some data from this additional field, which is field, data, field, EPA, FPP, body. Memorize that. No, that's not important to, it's really not important to remember. All right, so then once this gets into Layout Builder, how does the Layout Builder database structure look? Well, interestingly, there's only one table for Layout Builder layouts, and it's called node revision layout builder _ layout. So that layout builder _ layout should be familiar. That's the field we're migrating into, and it's storing this for each node revision. So if you look at this table, there's not really that much information here. And you could see in the last column, I kind of cheated here and just put serialized data. So the way Layout Builder actually stores the content for a layout display, instead of using these kind of relational databases, it puts everything into one big blob that honestly is not super human readable, kind of have to decode it. But all the information about how a layout is displayed is going to be stored in this last column, Layout Builder layout section. And so the goal of our process is to basically create some Drupal 8 object or Drupal instances of objects that would generate the serialized data and be able to be stored in the database. All right, now let's get to some code. Let's look at writing a source plugin. And remember, the goal of the source plugin is to limit the query of the nodes so that we're only loading up the nodes that actually use Panelizer. So one of the things I really love about Drupal 8 is the annotated plugins. So both source plugins and process plugins are, and the destination plugins for that matter, but we're not going to look at that. They're all what's called annotated plugins. And what an annotated plugin is basically we're defining an ID for this plugin and we're calling it EPA Panelizer node. And that through this annotated plugin system, that plugin is going to be available for us to use in the migration configuration. You might have heard me pause after I said what an annotated plugin is, because then I realized, wait a minute, I haven't dug in fully to understand exactly how this plugin becomes available and how it works. But basically what we're doing is we're creating a plugin, and the important part of an annotated plugin is having this correct configuration at the top so that we could use this in our configuration. This is kind of a skeleton for what a source plugin would look like. I've got the file name up here. This is also important to an annotated plugin, is where it's stored. So because this is in our custom module and it's in source, plugin, migrate, source, so the plugin type, or the plugins folder basically allows you to have different plugin types. So we're creating a migrate plugin, and this is a source migrate plugin. And then we've given it a custom name, and we're extending the node plugin. That node plugin comes with a module called migrate upgrade, which I'll talk a little bit about later. And essentially that does a couple great things for us. This node plugin will automatically load all the fields that exist for these nodes in Drupal 7. It allows you to have that type configuration in the configuration YAML. So we had type page. So we're limiting to pages because we're extending this node plugin. And it also provides the database connection for us to the Drupal 7 database. So there's two methods we need to look at within this source plugin, query and prepare row. And again, I'm really simplifying this just to focus in on the code that's important to us. So first we want to get the query, we want to load up the query that the node parent instance of this class provides, so that we have all that great stuff that it provides. And then we want to add some additional joins and some conditions so that we can limit the set of nodes down to the Panelizer nodes that we want to look at. So we're going to join with the Panelizer entity table and the panels display table, and then we're going to add a condition, basically exclude a node if the display ID is 0, and we're also going to exclude a node if it's using this specific layout, because I have a different way of migrating that stuff. So this is going to limit from the 300,000 nodes that are available down to maybe the 6,000 nodes that actually were using Panelizer. And then we're going to return this query. And then I should say when we're extending node also extends about maybe 4 or 5 other source plugin classes, like up through Drupal SQL base, and then so we want to make sure we're returning the query so that it continue to run through the parent classes. The next method we're going to look at is the prepare row. So the query method helps us limit the number of nodes that we're pulling in. The prepare row helps us pull in additional data about those nodes. So again, we want to run this, or basically load up the parent prepare row method so that it can be ignored. This node could be ignored if there was a rule in one of those that told us to ignore it. And then the first thing we want to do, the first piece of additional data that we want to get for each node is get the display ID. So we're just doing another query here on the Panelizer entity table to get the display ID for this revision ID that we're working with. And then next we want to load up the actual layout that this node was using. So we're looking at the panels display table that we looked at. Again, setting it, we're getting the layout for this display ID that we just got. And then we're just going to set the layout as a source property. So this row variable I didn't talk about yet. The row variable is essentially the representation of the data from the database. So in the query, we're pulling in the data. And then when we're in the prepare row, we're going to look at each node as a row. So think about like a database table. Each row is one node. So we're going to add another property to this row that's called layout. And this row is already going to have all the source properties for all the other fields that the node plugin provides, because we're extending that class. All right, so the last thing we need to do in our prepare row is actually fetch the panes. So we need to query the panels pane table, and we're going to basically just get all the fields that exist in panels pane, and we're going to only get the panes for this display ID. And then we're going to order them in a specific way, and then we're going to store those panes as a source property on the row. And essentially what the storing these as a source property on the row does is it allows us to use, now we can have this panes source value in our configuration, and then we could also, in the transformation, we could load any property from a row that we wanted to. So now we can use this EPA Panelizer node source plugin that we created. We're going to continue to give it the node type of page, which again is configured by the node class that we're extending, or the node source plugin that we're extending. And that's going to basically load up all the nodes that we want to migrate into Layout Builder that we're using Panelizer in D7 based on the conditions that we created. All right, so now let's process these nodes. I've been using a little bit of a shorthand for this so far, but I just wanted to point out when we migrate into the Layout Builder layout field, we're going to first want to run this array of panes through something called single value. And essentially what this is going to do is this is going to take this array and it's going to pass the entire array into the EPA panes to Layout Builder section plugin that we're going to write. And the reason for doing that is we want to work with all these panes in relationship to each other. If we didn't pass it through single value first, the way this process would work is we'd take the first pane and we would send it to the process plugin, and then we'd take the second pane and send it to the process plugin. But that wouldn't make any sense because these panes eventually all need to end up in one section for Layout Builder. If you remember, there's only one database row in that database table for Layout Builder. So we need to work with these all together. All right, so here's a skeleton for a process plugin. Again, this is an annotated plugin, and we're giving this an ID of EPA panes to layout builder section. And it's the same kind of place in the custom module, with the only difference being, instead of being a source plugin, we're now looking at a process plugin. And I wanted to call out two of the classes that we're using in this method. One is called section, that's the layout builder section, and another is called section component. And again, this is vastly simplified from what I ended up implementing, because what I actually ended up implementing was we created services for each pane, and this process plugin basically loaded up those services, determined the pane type, and then passed them off to that service. And the reason for doing that is because, as with fieldable panel panes, we actually need to query the database to get some more data for those. And normally in a process step of this migration, you wouldn't be going back to the database, or you wouldn't be gathering any more data, you'd already have it. But because of the kind of, what's the word I'm looking for? Dynamic nature of fieldable panel panes, where we could have many different types that have many different fields, it was much easier, instead of trying to gather all that data in the source plugin, it was much easier to focus just on the nodes in that source plugin, and then in the process plugin load any additional data that we needed. So we're going to look at a really simplified version of this. We're going to focus on creating the sections and section components and the blocks programmatically, because I feel like that was the part of this migration that actually was the most challenging, and there wasn't as much documentation out there for how to do that. So the only method we're going to look at with this process plugin is the transform method. And we're going to first start by just creating a section. So if you remember from the demo, the first thing I did when I got to that layout tab is I clicked add section. And I created that section with the research directory homepage type layout. And again, I have like my little disclaimer that in reality, this code would be much more complicated, but we're just going to kind of hard code the logic for that research directory layout. And we're just going to look at creating one block on that layout. So the first thing we need to do, we're kind of working in reverse from what we did on in the visual. So first we created the section, and then we added a block, and then we added the box, and then we added the HTML paragraph. First, we need to create the HTML paragraph so we can add it to the box, and then add it to the block, store it in the section. So creating a paragraph isn't too complicated, really. I do have some pseudocode here. This wouldn't work because I'm using this select. In a process plugin, you can't select from the database. That's where I would go out to my additional service that I created. But I just wanted, for completeness sake, to show you we need to get this data for the body field from this additional table. And then we're just going to create the HTML paragraph. So it's paragraph create, type HTML. And we're going to set the body field to the body field data that we queried up here. And then we're going to save it. So now that we have the HTML paragraph, we can create the box paragraph. Very similar. Type is box. The field paragraphs is that HTML paragraph that we created. And then we're going to save it. Okay, now this is where we're getting into the layout builder specific code. So what we've got is a block that we need to create. So you remember in the demo, we created the section and then we added a block to that section. So the block that we're going to create is going to be of the type block content. And the configuration for this block is similar to what I typed into the UI. We're just going to call it paragraph block. Its type is going to be paragraph. Remember when I clicked on paragraph, you couldn't really read that text, but I clicked on paragraph to create the block. And then I'm going to add that box paragraph to the field paragraphs. So this is the part that might be a little bit confusing. So like, where's that block entity? So essentially that block type of paragraph is created in the custom blocks library. So this would be very similar to just going in the Drupal UI and creating a new custom block of type paragraph, but we're just doing this programmatically. And we're storing that box paragraph, which has the reference to the HTML paragraph on it. All right, I see we're at 10:30. We're getting close to the end here, so we'll still have time for questions. So for layout builder, the blocks need to be wrapped into a section component. and this was the part that really stumped me it was like the hardest problem that I solved when I was working on this, because I didn't understand, like I was looking at the layout builder code, but I didn't understand what this block serialized configuration key was asking for. So you notice back here, I created this block, but I didn't save it. I didn't mark it as new. I didn't do anything other than create it. And essentially that just creating it this way allows me to pass it into this section component, which remember is one of the classes from Layout Builder, and I just need to pass it through serialize. And if you remember when we were looking at the Layout Builder table, it had that serialized block column. This is the way the Layout Builder needs to store this data. It has that kind of non-human readable serialized data block. So that was kind of the one gotcha that I ran into. So just to look at this in more completeness. So the section component needs a UUID, it needs a region. We're going to put it in the region main column. That was that first one in the left that spanned the two columns. And it's an inline block of paragraph. Again, the label doesn't really matter because we're not going to show it. And we're going to pass that block into this section component. Now, section component is kind of the one entity that you don't see in the UI, because the section component really is being created when you click that add block button. So now the last thing I'm going to do is we created that section on the first slide of the process plugin. I'm just going to append this component, the section component. I'm going to append that to the section. And then I would iterate through the rest of the panes, and I would create blocks and components for the rest of them. I would append them to the section, and then they would show up. For simplicity's sake, we're just going to look at that first one. The way you create the entities is the same for each of them. And again, just to reiterate the kind of hierarchy of what we've got going on here, the top level entity is a section. A section has section components, and those section components wrap blocks, and the blocks reference the paragraphs. All right, so now here's our process plugin in use. We've created the EPA panes to Layout Builder section plugin. We've simplified the logic a bit, but hopefully the gist of what we're doing is there. And now we're going to test the migration. So we're just going to run drush migrate import upgrade D7 node page panelizer. A trick I like to use is to add a node ID to the condition in our source plugin. So I'm only migrating one node, and I know exactly what I'm migrating, so it's a lot easier to test. And I do that just by modifying our query method and adding that additional condition. All right, drum roll, please. Let's run this migration, and we can see whether or not we were successful in creating this layout builder layout. Spoiler alert, I wouldn't be doing this if we didn't figure it out. So here's layout builder with the content from Drupal 7 migrated into these blocks using the research directory layout. I have another video to show, just scrolling the whole view so we can see that all the blocks were moved over. So again, we've got that main column with that first one spans 2 columns, and then the 3x2 grid. And then at the very bottom, well, what happened? We didn't migrate that block. Turns out that was a views pane in Panelizer, and the views panes were way too complicated to migrate. So what we're going to end up doing is just manually recreating them. There was about 300 of those. So it'll be a good amount of work, but that the client was able to, or wanted to accept that as a solution rather than spending the money on trying to figure out how to automate that part. And then again, just to look at the page, so that layout builder layout would translate into this view. All right, so I have some slides with resources and tips. Since we are a little bit running out of time, I will just go through these really quickly. Essentially, these were the things that I pulled out of the presentation when I gave this to my colleagues, and they're like, well, you're going really off track there. You don't need to talk about all that. So there's, using the migrate upgrade module, there's this migrate upgrade command that you could use with Drush, which is really great. I love it. It will essentially look at the Drupal 7 database. It'll connect to the Drupal 7 database, and it will create a migration configuration for every entity that exists in Drupal 7 that you can migrate. Really recommend that as a way of getting started as a baseline, so you don't end up, remember when I said those configurations can have hundreds of lines, so you don't end up writing that manually. And if you use the configure only flag, then you're generating these migrations or configurations, and you can go in and edit them, but it won't run the migration. It just gives you a baseline to work from. That migrate upgrade command also creates this migration group configuration, which is actually what defines how you're connecting to the database. Just wanted to point that out, that the database connection is stored somewhere. Additional tips: use Strush Generate to create scaffolds for your plugins. It's really time-saving tool. Something that I ended up pulling out of this was kind of a migration planning step. Before you write any of this code, I recommend having a really clear content model to understand where information is stored in Drupal 7 and how that's going to end up in Drupal 8. A lot of times when you're upgrading a site from Drupal 7 to Drupal 8, you're going to take the opportunity to change the content model, simplify things, maybe transition from files to media. So it's really important to know kind of how that's going to work before you start writing the code. And then the last thing to recommend is use the Layout Builder restriction module to clean up the Layout Builder interface. If you noticed, when I was adding blocks to the section in Layout Builder, really I only had the option to add a block, and then there were the two fields at the bottom. Layout Builder out of the box will provide hundreds of things that you can add to a layout that most content editors won't need to use. So it's a really handy module for simplifying that. All right, without further ado, I'd love to get to some Q&A. Also, will note this was my first time giving a Drupal camp presentation. So if you do have any feedback for how I could improve or do better next time, I'm totally open to hearing that.
Thanks, Brian. You did a great job. If that's your first, I couldn't tell at all. So that's awesome. So we've got a couple of questions so far that have rolled in. First one was, maybe I missed it, but how many nodes and paragraph entities needed to be migrated using this method for this particular project?
For this project, there's actually, this website is so much bigger than I ever anticipated. It has like 300,000 nodes. And within that, I think the number of Panelizer nodes is closer to, Panelizer nodes is closer to like 6,000. But this also was just one aspect of the migration. So I needed to migrate these Panelizer nodes into Layout Builder, but then I also needed to write do all the configuration for migrating the rest of the nodes into the fields. So I've been working on this really for about 3 months, not completely full time, but it's been a lot of moving parts, which is why that documentation is so important.
Oh, that's awesome. I had a question, a little bit, I guess, self-serving to ask a question as a moderator, but and I may have misunderstood it because of Mike's question. So first of all, were you coming from paragraphs to Layout Builder, or are you doing paragraphs with paragraphs place block inside Layout Builder on the D8 side?
Yeah, so on the D8 side, we're using that custom block, which just has a paragraphs field on it.
Okay.
And then we're actually creating the paragraphs in the Layout Builder interface. But what's being stored in Layout Builder is a block, and it just it has fields to reference those paragraphs.
And it references the paragraphs. Okay. And you're using a paragraph block. I believe that's contrib. At least sounds familiar. Is that?
I meant to do a little more research to know how we set up Layout Builder. So I'm not sure if it is a module that allows us to do that or if it's just a custom block. Okay,
that's fine. That's a little outside of scope of the talk. But everyone's always interested in the Layout Builder versus paragraphs versus anything else, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
that's a definite.
I had a whole section on deciding how to use Layout Builder that I also cut because we'd be here for another hour.
Oh, I bet. And the code snippets looked great too that you put in the deck. And those will be the slides will be available. Brian will have an email to send back the slides, and we'll get that posted on the website so everybody can look over those. Don't have to take screenshots throughout. I should have mentioned that early on. That'll be there. Any other questions? I don't see any. I think we had a good suggestion.
I'd also love to say, if anyone wants to see the more full code for how I migrated all of the different panes and how I created the different services, I'd be happy to share that. It would have just been impossible to share that in 30 minutes.
Oh yeah. No, that totally makes sense. And that's a great offer. Thank you for that. So anybody that wants to take Brian up on that later would be great. We did have another question just drop in. I wonder if you've tried or considered the Panelizer to layout builder upgrade provider. That's in, it looks like it's in Panelizer 8.5.
So I did look at some of the options that were available in Contrib, and I meant to say this at the start. As far as what I could tell, the stuff that existed for Panelizer was for Drupal 8 to Drupal 8 migrations. So they're like, what I saw was like in the Lightning profile, they're using Panelizer a lot. So they created a path to upgrade the Lightning stuff into Layout Builder, but it wasn't using Drupal 7 as a source. It was using Drupal 8 as a source. So far, I haven't seen anything for Drupal 7. I mean, it could be that I missed it in my research, but
no, that's
probably could have saved me a lot of time if there was something in Contrib.
Well,
but
yeah, and there could be. There's always lots of ways to do things in Drupal, so it's
Exactly.
totally fine. But you found a solid solution. You shared it with the community. I think that's great. I don't see any other questions, so Brian, just want to thank you for presenting at Drupal Camp Asheville this year, and really appreciate you contributing to the community like that. And there's some information there if you want to get in touch with Brian. Looks like his Twitter, Brian, your Twitter and your email. So that's cool. And that was a great job. And just real quick before we depart, I'm going to share a little screen here. Up next, we have our Expo Hall and networking opportunities at 1:45, and that's going to have a Drupal contractors demo during that time. So check that out and hop in. And then our next session block from 2 to 2:50 p.m. Eastern time. These are all Eastern time. We've got to remember that because we've got folks from all over the place, which is fantastic. Featured session on the stage. This is Carrie Fisher, who is really an accessibility expert. I don't know how else to say it, but I would trust Carrie with any accessibility questions. She's going to talk about accessible images when it matters most. So Brian, once again, thanks for everything. Oh, I see Lindsay asked a question. Session recordings will be available soon. I don't have a date and time on that, but I'd say just keep a watch out, and we'll push that out on the Drupal Camp Asheville social networks and things. So keep a watch out in the social media areas, and we'll get all of the sessions because they all are recorded, and we'll get them out there. Thanks again, Brian. And
thank you for having me. I really appreciate that.
Definitely.